Last week I made a video on the top 10 most missed removed abilities. Now let's talk about some of the abilities that no one will miss. At number 10 we've got the Beta Hunter's ability called Glimpse of Instincts. Never heard of the ability before? Well, there's a good reason why. It's what hunters were going to use before tracking spells were put in the game. Its tooltip reads, share your pet's senses, gaining any detection or tracking abilities for 30 seconds. Which doesn't explain much in the way of what it actually did. Basically, what it did was allow you to track different mobs based on what pet you use Glimpse of Instincts on. So it essentially made tracking tougher to use. And Blizzard was all like, you know what? Tracking really isn't that important to hunters. Let's just give them tracking spells rather than this clunky mechanic. And so they did. Number 9, Mocking Blow. Mocking Blow was a melee ability which taunted and did little damage. Sounds good, right? Did you also know that you couldn't use it in defensive stance? The only stance in which you'd want an extra taunt? Also, it had a 2-minute cooldown. Now, I'm pretty sure it had some uses, like maybe taunting a player's pet in PvP if you happen to be in melee range, or using it to tank swap and then switching to defensive stance immediately if you just really didn't want to use taunt for some reason. Or if it missed, I guess. But taunt didn't have a 2-minute cooldown, and it could be used at range. In Wrath, it was made a little more useful. Its cooldown was lowered to 1 minute, and could be used in defensive stance. Then they removed it in Cataclysm because it was kinda a redundant ability. Number 8, Ghostly Strike. Out of all the abilities on this list, this one was probably the least useless. The ability did decent damage and increased your chance to dodge by 15% for about 5 seconds. Awarded a combo point, but costs more energy to use than your basic combo generator like Sinister Strike, and had a 20-second cooldown. So, it was a neat little minor dodge buff you could get for 5 seconds every 20 seconds, but not really worth picking up, and was skipped by pretty much all sub-rogues. Apparently, at one point in vanilla, the ability also did damage to you when you used it, but I couldn't really find any more information on that besides a patch note saying it did. In Wrath, it was made a little bit more useful by allowing it to do more damage with daggers, which sub-rogues actually used, but still was pretty much skipped since it was more of a fluff ability that wasn't very useful. The ability might be returned in Legion with a much better effect and no stupid 20-second cooldown, but at this point it's not really the same skill anymore if it's nothing like its past self. Number 7, Windwall Totem. This totem was one of the many weird druid buff totems shamans had in the past. What it did was reduce damage from ranged attacks by a fixed amount. Sounds neat, right? Until you learn that it literally only worked against hunters. It didn't affect spells, just physical ranged attacks like bows or thrown weapons. Surprisingly, it wasn't used very much, and wasn't really missed when it was removed in Wrath. Number 6, Detect Magic. Before the tail end of the Burning Crusade, players could only see debuffs put on targets, and couldn't see if they had any kinds of buffs. So, mages could use Detect Magic to allow everyone to see the buffs the target had. Then in patch 2.3, Blizzard just made this a baseline thing of the game, and now everyone can see buffs on everything, making it completely useless. Number 5, Sanctity Aura. Pallies had a lot of auras in their days before they were all removed, and Sanctity Aura was probably the least useful one to have in a group setting, unless you ran a very specific group comp. What it did was give everyone in your group 10% extra holy damage. You know how many classes use holy damage as part of their main damage? Only paladins. The aura was only useful for other paladins. Don't get me wrong, it was a great damage buff for ret pallies, and was always taken when it was a talent, but it really shouldn't have been tied to an aura, since there were a couple of other more useful auras to buff your group members with besides a buff that literally only affected yourself and other paladins. It did have a talent which made it a more useful aura, like boosting the healing of party members with it, and later giving it a tiny damage boost, like 1 to 2% extra damage, but then it was removed in Wrath and returned in Warlords as an ordinary buff, which just gives 3% versatility. So technically this ability is still in the game, but it was removed for 2 expansions and works nothing like it used to. Number 4, Shadow Word Insanity. This was a very short-lived spell in Mist that had an interesting concept. What it did was allow you to consume your Shadow Word Pain dot on the target and deal some pretty nice single target burst damage. Only the Shadow Priest kinda didn't like to remove their dots from targets, and you could only use the ability when the dot had less than 6 seconds left on its duration. And Shadow Word Pain lasted about 18 seconds, I think. So if you wanted to use it off cooldown, you could only use it once every 12 seconds. It was a pretty clunky spell that actually interfered with the priest's normal rotation. Blizzard tried buffing its damage to make it worth removing one of your dots, but eventually they just gave up and replaced it with a much more useful Insanity buff, which would double the damage of Mind Flay while Devouring Plague was on the target. Number 3. Scorpid Sting. Back when hunters had multiple stings, they could only have one sting on a target at a time, similar to how Warlock Curses used to work. The thing is though, hunters use Serpent Sting about 99% of the time since it was a good dot and part of their normal rotation. And the other 1% of the time they were using Viper Sting to slowly drain a healer's mana in PvP. Scorpid Sting was a debuff sting that was never really that good. Its first form reduced the target's strength and agility by a fixed amount. Its second form, which it had until its removal, gave the target a small hit chance reduction. I mean, it wasn't bad. You had to choose whether or not to use this sting over the two others, which were much more useful though. If they had removed its one sting per target limitation, I could see hunters actually using it. But they didn't. They just removed the skill in Kata when they removed all hit chance reduction abilities like Insect Swarm. While I'm on the topic of hunters, let me talk about two other useless abilities that were removed. The first being Lacerate. This was the last point talent for Survival Hunters Vanilla, and was infamous for being the worst dot in the game. And the worst last point talent ever. It didn't scale with gear and had terrible baseline damage. There's also Counterattack, another hunter melee skill that never really saw use. It had a nice effect, the attack couldn't be avoided, did okay-ish damage, and rooted the target for 5 seconds. But it was only usable after parrying an attack. And hunters were not in melee very often or long enough to get a parry, and didn't have high parry anyway. So if a hunter wanted to use it, they'd only be able to use it once in a blue moon. But it actually stayed in the game for a really long time despite not being all that useful or used, and wasn't removed until Mist of Pandaria. Number 2. Cower. The Kitty Druid's Cower ability lowered their threat by a tiny amount for 20 energy on a 10-second cooldown. Now, threat reduction isn't bad, but this ability wouldn't save your life if you pulled aggro. At best, it could be used when your threat was getting a little too high to lower it a tiny bit. But in order to learn the max rank of this ability, you had to get a book which dropped off a boss in a dungeon. So you had to go out of your way to learn the last rank of a pretty mediocre threat reduction. Rogues and Hunters had pretty similar threat reduction abilities as well, and the Hunter one was almost completely useless. Theirs required them to be in melee range to use when Hunters were a ranged class. And they already had Feign Death, so they absolutely never needed to use it since Feign Death is one of the best threat reduction abilities in the game. I'd have to put the Hunter's Cower on this list if it wasn't remade into a really good ability. Their threat reduction was their disengage ability. You know, the one that lets them leap backwards. And the Rogue's threat reduction was turned into an AoE damage reduction ability, which is actually pretty useful in raids. The Druid's threat reduction ability was just removed because it sucked, instead of being turned into a more better, useful ability like the Rogues and Hunters threat reduction ability was turned into. Alright, and now it's time for number 1. What is the most useless removed ability? Well, it's kinda hard to say spells are totally useless, as pretty much everything has some kind of situational usefulness. Except vanilla Firestones. Those were the definition of useless. Number 1 on this list is Spell/Firestones. Spellstones were a pretty shitty mechanic for Warlocks. What you did was waste one of your soul shards to create one of these things that you had to equip in your offhand to use. That's right, you had to take up one of your equipment slots if you wanted to use one of your abilities. The Spellstone would remove magic effects from the Warlock and give you a shield that absorbed magic damage. The Firestone would give your main hand weapon extra fire damage every time you attacked with it. Extra fire damage on melee strikes. Not that Warlocks used weapons to actually ever fight with. They were later changed to be equipable in the wand slot. Still dumb, but at least not as damaging as putting it in the offhand slot. and gave them better effects than doing extra fire damage on melee attacks. Which I might stress, Warlocks never did. A Warlock could do more damage wanding than using a Firestone to boost its melee damage. Then they were changed again in Wrath to be weapon enchants and give useful buffs. Then they removed a miss because they were still kinda dumb.